Hello, everyone. So I'm Ollie O'Mara. I'm a consultant clinical psychologist. My day job is forensic CAMHS, so young people in touch with the criminal justice system, and then I also help out a lot on the trauma-informed care project for CAMHS and TUVE. Joyce, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, I'm Joyce Powell. I'm also a consultant clinical psychologist. My day job is with Durham Local Authority, working predominantly with looked after children, and currently I'm the trauma lead in CAMHS across TUVE.
Etiquette rules, be nice to each other, use the chat function. Paris, unfortunately, the way that you've set it up, I can't see the chat, so I'm going to rely on Joyce to monitor the chat and interrupt me when I need to stop. And use the chat function for chatting about, if you can hear a crying toddler in the background, that is mine. And he's probably refusing to put on clothes or something along those sort of lines. So apologies if he runs in thinking it's hilarious. That has happened on numerous Zoom calls and so forth. So today we're chatting about trauma-informed care during a pandemic, a CAMHS perspective. Hopefully giving people an opportunity to connect, touch base, share ideas, create new ideas. Hopefully there's not going to be too much new. Hopefully there's new ideas, but it might be re-going over some old grounds. Because we talk about trauma, so it's an emotive subject, keep yourself safe. If you need to take time out, please do so. That is some of the benefit of Zoom calls and online world, is that we can just turn off our cameras or close our laptops. Like I said before, curious questions are always welcome. And I'll give Joyce opportunities during the chat today to pause, reflect, take anything that we're interested in. So what we're going to do today, we'll do a quick recap of trauma-informed care. We'll think about the pandemic through a trauma-informed lens. We'll think about what young people have told us about their experience of the pandemic, and then also what staff have told us about their experience of the pandemic, and then what we've done and what we can do, which will probably be the interesting part. And if there's anything else that people want to cover, write it in the chat and we'll try and come to it at the end. We've got an hour together. If we finish earlier, we finish earlier. Unfortunately, we won't be able to run over because that's our allotted time, but we'll see how it goes. So quick recap. Hopefully everyone's aware of trauma-informed care. The 4 R's of realizing the impact of trauma, recognizing it, responding appropriately, and resisting re-traumatization, and using the 5 pillars of safety, trust, choice, collaboration, empowerment. And I'm going to talk a little bit later about what that means, and the tagline being not what's wrong with someone, but what's happened to them, to understand their experience and strategies that they've used to cope with those experiences. Now, I've put in, it's not just trauma therapy, because I think people can often get misrepresented around thinking, right, everyone needs trauma-focused CBT, or everyone needs EMDR, eye movement desensitization reprocessing, or other specific trauma therapy. No, what we're talking when we're talking about trauma-informed care is a real culture shift from around moving away from process-driven targets and seeing people as numbers, so to speak, or just going along, to creating space to think, encouraging safety, restoring power and worth. And what I like is what Epstein describes as supporting reflections in place of reaction, curiosity in lieu of numbing, self-care instead of sacrifice, and collective impact rather than siloed structure. So that's why some of these webinars are really positive in terms of being able to connect with others. and understand what else other people are doing. And it does create a whole culture shift in an organization to do that. So we need changes in policy, procedure, ways of working and being with our families and young people. So when we're thinking about the pandemic through a trauma lens, what we're noticing is that everyone's going through a threat system at the moment. We've got family illness, we've got stress, and actually it's going to the point of chronic stress. So we've been in the pandemic for 18 months now, maybe longer. And what people are describing is no escape. The news is constantly full of pandemic. It seems to occur in every conversation. And what we're noticing is due to the isolation that people are feeling, there's reduced connections. And when we get reduced connections, we get reduced resources. And even though there has potentially been some reduced demands in some places, it's depending on how people are coping at home will depend on how that balance is acting. So when we think about stress and we think about normal positive stress of that gets us to do deadlines and stuff, when I was writing this webinar, and maybe tolerable stress of making sure I'm not doing it late last night, to then thinking things that are becoming overwhelming. And then when we border in the what professionals call toxic stress, is when there's no support system around us, when there's no emotionally available adult to help us make sense of our experience, so that we have to make sense of it ourselves. So what impact has this had on young people, and what have they told us? So we asked young people, and there's a fair amount of literature out there now around young people telling lots of people are struggling, it's stressful, they're missing friends, family, the loneliness and not feeling as safe, lots of worries about exams and future, frustration, sometimes anger about the impact of the pandemic on their lives. And two of our young people described it really well, of like some people are experiencing it like a thunderstorm at the moment, and sort of like an isolated boat out there that's drifting off and getting battered by waves. Another young person described it as like two bubbles. So one which had an idealized version of the past when we could meet up with friends and see the park and everything, and then the other bubble of that uncertain future. When's this going to end? How's this going to be? How do I make sense of all this? Which I thought were two really apt sort of descriptions of actually what is going on for everyone. Young people saying they're a bit all over the place. Some days okay, some days no motivation, and just sort of getting used to it, but then being bogged down by social media and the news, and sort of saying, well, this is life. There's also the part of like that increase of time on the internet. Internet's amazing, but it is all the information in the world at your fingertips with no scaffolding or structure, which is a real risk for our young people in terms of what they can access, which they can go down a rabbit hole and not realize what they're watching, and how they make sense of it. And that's why we're talking about that emotionally available adult to help them make sense of what they've seen on the internet, which is sometimes hard because we don't know what they're looking at. And then we wondered about, well, what about young people that have experienced early life adversity more than other young people, or more present or more prevalent? And they said actually they thought the pandemic could have created different circumstances that create more stress or more pressure, or bring them back to the trauma that they experienced when they were younger, such as being stuck in the house could bring back memories, or more time spent in your own head, and having less distraction, and therefore more opportunities for flashbacks or reliving experiences. And a Wales study also, when they were doing a survey of all sort of thousands of young people, they noticed that actually young people that generally face barriers in the system are struggling more. So young people and families with disabilities being more likely to be worried about the coronavirus, BAME populations more likely to feel lonely and more likely to say that they feel unsafe. So when we're thinking about trauma-informed care, we're thinking about how do we adapt our systems and responses to appreciate what young people are experiencing. But we also heard that it's not all doom and gloom. So there were sparkly moments along the way. So people saying actually they're enjoying learning at their own pace from home. Actually they're enjoying not having to see people and feeling less pressure, enjoying more time with family, time away from school, actually feeling it's calming. And I think that's a real challenge about how we understand how the young person has experienced the pandemic and how traumatizing it is. And what we appreciate, or what their base level of understanding. Do they prefer to stay by themselves generally, or do they like to spend time with other young people, which is obviously going to then have an impact of whether they're enjoying lockdown or not. And then we thought about, okay, well, so that's our young people and families experience. What about our staff experience? And a colleague of mine, Kay, did some work with our youth justice colleagues and came up with this nice description of actually what has been the thought process through the pandemic. So back in March 20th, so looking at the last year, sort of that shock and then adaptation of going, okay, this is a new normal. And then that surely it won't last too long. And then, oh my God, it's still happening. And it's still happening, really still. And then that feeling of that a lot of systems are having now around burnout, compassion fatigue, not having the resources or outlets that you would normally have to vent or let go. And what people have noticed is behavioural changes, increase in irritability, frustration, memory difficulties, Zoom fatigue or online fatigue, reduced intimacy, reduced satisfaction, sleep problems, being critical about choices, and mixed emotions. And what struck me about this is, again, this is no different from the young people and families that we work with, going through the same thing, noticing the same patterns. And the question that I'm left with is, how do we support our staff and workforce to process what they're going through? But I'll come on to that a bit more. So what we've noticed is more compassion fatigue, more burnout, more moral injury, more vicarious trauma. So when we talk about compassion fatigue, that ability to have a loving kindness towards other people. And when we're talking about burnout, we're talking about the resilience, the resources, the drive that we start to lose, that we're tired all the time, our sleep's problematic. When we talk about moral injury, we're talking about doing things that are against our values. So being asked to act in a way that doesn't fit with our agency, and but not feeling able to act differently, and potentially seeing more of this in our health sector. And then vicarious trauma, we're hearing so many trauma stories, and it's how we're taking them on, and it's filling us up, and how we make sense of that. I was struck by a couple of chats that I've had with colleagues lately, where who have had experiences of COVID and lost loved ones through COVID, that when people are coming back from the wards or people are coming back from ITU and they're sharing what's happening, that they don't have the space to process it. They know that they can't hear it because it's too triggering for their experience. And when we're thinking about our hospitals, one comment that really struck me of the how people coping and going, well, we've got the crying corridor, and that really felt the need for a crying corridor when things become too much and too overwhelming. Shows the level of pressure and fullness in the system that is a caring profession. So how do we then be caring towards others and help other young people make sense and families make sense of their experience if we're too full ourselves? So sort of mixing my metaphors, but when the bucket is full but the jug is empty, how do we pour from an empty jug? And we'll come on to self-care later, but what are the things that let water out of our bucket? How do we create systems that don't overwhelm us, don't overwhelm our young people and families, but also don't overwhelm the staff that work with them? So quite a helpful sort of model that I find is window of tolerance when thinking about threat. And what we've seen when we're thinking about pandemics through a trauma lens is that it's been shrinking people's windows because there's more stress and less normal coping strategies. How do we then increase our window, and how do we escape going into hyperarousal, that freeze response, stuck response, or hyperarousal and chaos, while being mindful of that some of our workforce needs to still be in crisis and rescuing mode and firefighting mode, that they have to think, and it's not until afterwards that they then have to make sense and fit it into their internal model of the world. And that's really challenging. I'll pause it there. Joyce, anything, any questions or reflections or anything that's coming through, or have I stunned people into silence? This is always weird about like only a one-way thing.
I haven't seen any. I've got the chat open, so I'm just going to check with Paris. There's none that I'm just not seeing, but I haven't seen any.
No, there's none.
No.
Cool. And I hope that's because people are being thoughtful and reflective rather than it's not making any sense. But if it is not making any sense, please write that into the chat as well and go, Ollie, what are you on about? That's absolutely fine and we'll adapt. So what have our young people said about experiences of services? Because that's what we're sort of wondering about. How can we be trauma informed in current times? They've said, well, it was good not to be rushed, going at my pace. It was good because nobody said or challenged the way I was thinking. After a while, I felt confident to chat to people. It was nice because my worker knew my mum before we could chat, and therefore that felt safer. What they would like us to change, they asked really irrelevant stuff. They asked random questions, and young people going like, what you on about? I don't like being asked why all the time. And that danger of curiosity from our workforce or carers being, while really important, when a young person doesn't have an answer, can be overwhelming. Being late, and then also knowing who to talk to at the right time. So chatting with foster carers, parents beforehand to get a better picture so that the young person doesn't have to repeat their story. Carers, often feeling like they have to fight for appropriate services, sometimes feeling patronized, not believed, difficulty with sensitive information, sometimes a conversation being very problem saturated and that being overwhelming, carers and parents feeling blamed, workers not always recognizing the developmental stage of young people and the impact of trauma. Megan Middlemass, one of our psychologists in the service, did her thesis on what it was like to access service for people that have had developmental trauma, and she came up with a really nice model, and I'm sure the thesis will be available soon. I don't know whether it's been published yet, but sort of this description of having to go in the ring with a professional boxer after you finish a marathon. And this is what we're trying to highlight, the experience of trauma in the system being overwhelming and the resources that are available, and then having to feel like you have to then jump through another hoop or go through another battle or explain your story again. And sort of this is what we're sort of describing for the need for trauma-informed care, to take a step back and appreciate what the experiences have been and how long these experiences have been going on. So it's a helpful model to sort of make sense. But the overall themes about what families and young people were looking for was calm, friendly, sensitive, empathic, feeling safe, not going straight into solutions and problem solving, but actually trying to create safety and stabilization in the system, building up trust, considering the wider system, including parents, carers for the young person, but schools and how important they are, empowerment being key, building on people's strengths and resilience, and recognizing endings can be really challenging. And sort of the reflection from carers and young people is like, it's not rocket science, it's what we'd hope all services to do. And therefore we then become curious when people don't act in this way, or when they're too overwhelmed by stress or pressure or their own trauma, that thinking space is reduced. That's what we're wondering about in terms of our trauma-informed care systems, is how do we increase that space for reflection and time. So top tips from our young people, what they're looking for like in pandemic times, in general times: be predictable, be available, be consistent, answer your phone, call us back, write down the right thing. Some young people said, actually, it'd be nice to not talk about the pandemic, try and create some normal conversations and how to escape negativity, to bring some of the fun back, because this is what our common theme was, is actually our number of positive experiences, and I don't have the research for this, but I wonder if they've been reduced. And therefore, if we're not having as many positive experiences or rewarding experiences or pleasant feelings, and we're getting this blob of pandemic, how does that feel in terms of headspace? So I'll pause there. Joyce, I've seen some people writing. I think
they have indeed. One of the things that I'd start with is that Megan has submitted her thesis for a paper and has got through the first stage. So hopefully there will be a paper on that one. Lots of positives, comments about the presentation being helpful for the young people that people are working with. And a comment about the fact that some children are happier at home than at school, which was certainly our experience when we were talking to our young people. So thinking about how we can make the transition back into school after having, I guess, such a long lockdown, less traumatic. And I think that's the main question that we've got, Ali.
Yeah. And what we're describing around our systems being more reflective and open is also what we'd love is more creative and flexible. So actually what works. I was struck by probably not that healthy to listen to 5 Live all the time on my way in the car, but because every chat seems to be about some sort of level of pandemic, but the schools and this race towards qualifications and that not fitting with a lot of our young people, and who started this race or who created this race and why when we know that everyone moves at a different pace and have different needs and have different skills and strengths. So I work with a lot of young people that don't fit into the education system, and when it works well, the solution is creative, individual, person-centered. When it doesn't work so well, it's the opposite. So I think a really important point from that person around how do we get responsivity in the system that people feel empowered to do something different. We'll come on to that a little bit in the later. So what we've done so far in terms of CAMHS, we've done a big emphasis on increasing awareness about the impact of trauma, especially its in the shame narrative that's held by some of our young people. And for clarity, shame being people think they're bad rather than guilt where you've done a bad thing. So shame, holding that badness within yourself and being about yourself, and that being dependent on the developmental age of young people. Actually, if they can't make sense of why something bad has happened, say sort of our really young primary school children, then how to get a narrative away so that they're not storing it and making it and storing it within themselves. So Kim Golding and Dan Hughes and people that do dyadic developmental psychotherapy talk a lot about the shame shield, which we're thinking about with regards to our services. Also thinking about trust. So actually, how do we go at the young person's pace? How do we ensure consistency and understanding stress? So understanding who's available in the system to reduce those demands and also create safety, and appreciating that we don't see things as they are, we see things as we are. So we make sense of it via our internal model. And then Karen Treisman work, who's done a lot of trauma-informed care, sort of highlighting that every interaction is an intervention. So every time that we meet a young person, family, colleague, is an opportunity to rejuvenate, refresh, connect, to give them a different experience of maybe what they've had in the past or what they're currently experiencing. And like we described earlier, concentrating on safety, trust, choice, co-production, empowerment. So actually young people and families co-producing our services, our resources, are changing our services. So what does this practically look like? So getting the right person at the right time, not getting the young person or family member to repeat their story over and over again every time they meet a new clinician. And we've seen some real differences in our single point of contact or single point of access around our clinicians being getting information from external sources, but then also signposting to appropriate clinician who would then be at a place to explore it further if the young person was ready. I had, because I get lots of referrals from other services, had a lovely experience of a family that had experienced significant adversity and trauma, and the clinician had a lovely conversation with the mum around how much they wanted to share versus how much is available elsewhere that can tell the story. And actually we can then rely on that other information so that we don't then re-traumatize and get desensitized to the for the young person and family. Like sort of describe using Kim Golding pyramid of need, concentrating on feeling safe physically, emotionally, and having that as our basis, and understanding that that's what we need if we're going to process trauma. And if we don't have that, how do we create it? And that's not relying on one service or one person. That's a systems approach to intervention. And then once we've got a level of safety, that's alongside building trusting relationships, and then moving on to comfort and co-regulation, and really trying to understand where our young people and families are within the system, and taking the time to appreciate what's going on, and what their experience and how they've made sense of it, and whether it's still going on. So how do you create a trauma-informed care environment, which we're going to come on to a bit now? So self-care being our bedrock. You, like say, can't pour from an empty jug. So our carers, our parents, our staff concentrating on themselves so that they know what their triggers, and they're not overwhelmed, not coming to work overtired, overstressed, overpressured, and understanding from all levels of the system to do that. Creating space to think and reflect. And a big one for me is like how to create psychological safety. So psychological safety being the difference between trust and psychological safety, that others will give the benefit of the doubt when people take risks, or try and understand the approach that the other person has gone. There's some Google are big into psychological safety, and there's lots of other organizations that are doing it really well. Some of them have radical policies like no gossiping, like you can't talk about someone unless they're in the room, versus radical candor, so everything's open, to more practical steps of feeling supported by your manager, service manager, director, and system around you, so that there isn't feelings of blame, which then leads to shame in the system. And often people can notice whether their psychological safety in the system will be how the conversations are had, or how people act, and that feeling of safety with your colleagues and families. And when we're thinking about self-care, I still can't remember where I heard this from. I think I was either reading a book or listening to a podcast. But the different between empathy and compassion, and they activate different pathways in our brain. So our empathy activating our pain pathway, whereas our compassion activating our reward pathway. And that being really interesting around, actually, we do try and promote lots of empathy, but then maybe that's filling up our bucket quite a lot. Whereas compassion might make us help with connections and pouring stuff out of our bucket. And also that really important part of compassion for yourself. And I know that Paul did a lot of stuff around the compassion series in the other webinars, so I'll not go over that. But how we treat ourselves with self-kindness and understand our own stories and our own triggers, so that we can appreciate what the impact of the current environment is having on us, and what impact that our relationships have on us. So we've also concentrated on space to think. So increasing reflective practice in teams, encouraging clinicians to notice their own triggers, responsive formulation time. So actually, how do we understand with the young person and family their journey, their way of thinking, their outlook and light, so that there can be shared problem solving, processing time. And I've also put escape time, not like literally escape, but like actually how to not feel overwhelmed. How do you build in your system thinking time and privileged thinking time as much as doing time? And that's one of the real challenges when sometimes our organizations can be very results numbers driven, and how to take a step back from that to see the whole system as a whole, to create flexibility and, like I said, creativity. If we don't have space to think, we'll still do the same thing and fall back on the same patterns that we've always done. So one of my challenges back to all of you is what takes you back into your window, and understanding that when we link it back to our window of tolerance. And again, mixing my metaphors, but what empties your bucket? So actually what relieves stress, what takes it out, but then what fills up your jug? So actually what are the things that make you feel good about yourself so that you can go into work, or you go into your family, or whatever you do, that means that you can be compassionate towards people, that you can give resources. And another article I was reading was about you gain wealth through giving. It was describing a incident of his dad borrowing sugar off a neighbour, and this young person was going, "Why do you borrow sugar off the neighbour? We've got loads of sugar at home." And the dad said, "Well, because then it feels he's then more likely to accept help, and actually he's then more likely to then take on more from us, and it doesn't feel like pity or charity," which I thought was quite interesting in terms of our narrative of helping. So what does the future look like? And I don't know where I got this from either. I'm not being great with my referencing today. But I thought it was quite a nice model around what's happening currently in society, that we had the threat, although it seemed to happen quite quickly. Maybe some people were more informed about it than others. And then we've had this heroic response from our health sector, from people in general, around coping. And then what they've noticed after, so this model is around what happens after significant disasters, is we get a level of community, and then we drop, and there'll be anniversaries, which will be triggering events. There'll be second waves of what happens in the next winter or everything, and that leading to a level of disillusionary, and then the restructuring. And I suppose one of the questions that I'm left thinking about is, how do we create systems that have space and understanding, passions for that? Another conversation that I had with colleagues was, again, the difference between empathy and compassion of our health workers not always having space to think about how other people are coping, and when everyone's firefighting and in it together, and then some people aren't in that place, that can lead us to an us and them narrative, or it can lead us to a blaming narrative if we don't take time to appreciate and be compassionate. So how do we take a step back and realize that everyone's on their own journey? How do we take a step back and realize that everyone has their own resources and stresses, and everyone's window will be different, everyone's bucket will be different sizes, everyone's jug will be different sizes. Maybe I need to water the garden. I don't know why I'm keep on going about these metaphors, but they sort of work in my head. So what needs to change? That is over to you guys. Like, what's the thing that you need to do in your household or in your head or in your organization to create more trauma-informed systems. And one of the questions I'm left with, how can we make connections? Because if we're in a disconnected society currently, how do we then reconnect or link up to be with others? So one of the things I would say is that you are braver than you believe. I've stolen this as well. And actually, how do we challenge some of our systems to put ourselves out there to say things are different? And nobody has all the answers. That's why we have each other. So that bit around connecting and understanding is Arnold Schwarzenegger did a really nice talk about self-made man and it being an absolute myth. I think it's on YouTube if any's a big Arnie fan, but that myth of like that he did it all himself and that was only said is rubbish. He had so many people to help him, and that's the thing that made him great. So how do we get our tribe together to support each other to create a, I don't know what metaphor, net web to create change. So that's the end of me talking. I probably talked longer than I intended. Apologies if you have my toddler in the background or the doorbell going. But questions, reflections, did any of it not make sense?
The comment about the difference between empathy and compassion, and it's really relating to that, and that being a really important distinction for clinicians. And also a comment that that one of our young people thought it was very inspiring, which I think is really important. Yes, also someone thinking about feeling quite concerned about their daughter going back to school, and maybe some of the things we talked about today being really helpful in thinking about how you approach that, because often as parents and carers that you become real advocates, don't you, for the young people. Another person talking about a particular challenge for a client who has OCD, and that worry, that is actually something that we've seen because of, obviously there's so much discussion about washing your hands, keeping things clean, and that causes its own really individual challenges. And a question, Ollie, will this presentation be available to view again? I was going to say, Ollie, it might even be for Paris. As I understand it, it gets put onto the Recovery College as something you can listen to.
Yeah, that's my understanding. And I think we didn't touch on the level of anxiety in the system or the impact on that on young people's health around contamination risk and so forth. And we didn't touch on people that have diagnosis of autism or learning disability that have struggled to make sense of the pandemic. So struggled to it's been, because it is still an abstract concept. So I think that's a really important point around whether we'll see an increase in referrals or there'll be a need for help. We also didn't talk that much around loss and grief, and lots of people have lost loved ones, and that again will be impact on again anniversaries and changes in family and so forth. So I think that will be really important for people to hold in mind. And I realized at the end of this that I went, right, questions, without creating any space for thinking. So I sort of didn't follow my own rules there. So I'm hoping, like people have talked about, it's been thought-provoking, or at least has created some sort of level of curiosity in people that can that they can take back and have thinking time with their own systems, whether that be family or organizations or teams.
A couple more comments. Claire's confirmed that the webinars are available through the Recovery College online, and got another couple of comments there. Giles is interested in the concept of an emotionally available adult. What do young people say about how they recognise whether an adult is emotionally available? If I was to think about the answer to that, I think our young people are very tuned into us, and they really know, they suss you out. You can't will pull the wool over their eyes at all. And the other thing is about trust. It's really important to have that trusting relationship. I'm just mindful of, we might go back to that, but there's another question there about how have we built in that really important space and reflective time into our individual teams' working day, and this person works in an IAP service, and it's a major barrier. And absolutely, I can speak for the service I'm in, that one of the reflections that a lot of people have made in having to adapt to an online world is that actually we've been able to be a lot more efficient at times, which has meant that we've had practically back-to-back appointments and meetings, which means that we see lots more people, but doesn't give us that reflective space in the context of being isolated from the rest of the team and the usual very natural kind of support that you give, that yes, you can ring up a colleague, but it's not quite the same because you don't do that in the same way as you would if there was a colleague just across the corridor or just across the way, that you would just share. And I think that's been a massive, that sort of fragmentation has been really massive for people. And also carers and parents as well, because the support networks and the things that they normally do aren't available. So yeah, that would, I don't know if there's anything else for you, Ollie?
Yeah, so in answer to both those questions, the emotionally available adult comes from like Peter Vonnegui's work, who's down at the Anna Freud Centre. So if you Google that and Peter Vonnegut, and I think there's a couple of papers that come out around the protective qualities of emotionally available adult. I agree with Joyce that young people are normally very attuned, and young people who have experienced significant trauma are often very attuned to who are non-judgmental and accepting, and who's available versus who maybe is more focused on change. And I think that's one of the key things around emotionally availables, of taking that DDP stance of acceptance and being with and being non-judgmental, to then create space to think about different possibilities. And so whereas some systems can go in with a very solution focused change angle of like, this is what needs to change, then our young people can often then close down and become more rigid to that threat that they think is potentially some of their strategies have been very helpful and protective in the past. Therefore, trying to get lots of change might be too threatening. In terms of the building in reflective capacity in services, buy-in from senior management, even really high levels, directors and people to value it. In my team, we have a case discussion booked in monthly, we have reflective practice booked in monthly, and I do reflective practice for other teams that have that value it and prioritize it. And I suppose the encouragement that I would give is to raise the argument of that this is as important as face-to-face client work, because if you're not looking after yourself and processing, then that's when we close down our thinking.
I know we're mindful of time, but there's another comment from Chloe, who is discussing the her role in education, and let me just have a look. Says She says, as part of the curriculum, my role is being highlighted more by, I think, a speech and language therapist to help re-engage, signpost and help out these students struggling with post-COVID trauma. Like your pyramid of need, I know colleagues in education use the Maslow's hierarchy of need. There's an educational version, I've seen that, looking at a holistic view of clients' motivations and decision-making around careers advice. And provide sits further down the priority list at the moment as people are unable to see past the pandemic. And I think that is a problem, isn't it? That with a lot of areas, that because the pandemic has become such a big thing, it's almost like a barrier to thinking in and brings in uncertainty about everything. So all our young people who are looking towards the future have got that sort of personal uncertainty alongside all the uncertainty that the pandemic brings as well.
Yeah, and I think this balancing between qualifications and well-being is really important. There are some really positive stories from schools that they're concentrating very much on the well-being and the reconnecting and the not rehabilitation, but that sort of theme of like they're slowing down the process. I'm probably seeing that more in primary schools than secondary schools. But I think the conflict when people are in different stages, so when they're doing the GCSEs or A levels, of how do we help create space and take a step back from those things. So I think that, yeah, and again, is how do we challenge the system slightly, be a little bit rebellious, to ask the difficult questions of decision makers and offer alternative solutions to that. I've just seen another. I'm aware of time. Should we?
Yes, I think we're about 3 minutes. Yeah. And Lucy has said she's works with people with physical health issues. Says that thinks a lot about the clients with complex physical health issues in hospital who felt much more connected with teachers during online teaching and less different from peers. I can parallel that with looked after young people who've found that easier and felt that they've been able to manage and if they've had any school-related anxieties, have been able to sort of manage those better and being in the same boat as other young people.
And I think that sort of harks back to the creative solutions of like actually finding what fits and actually how do we have models that adapt to the needs of the young people and families that we work with. So I think it's a really important point that Lucy makes. We've run out of time today. I hope that's been helpful in terms of connecting and thinking time. It will be on YouTube, and the PowerPoint presentation will be, or slides will be on the Recovery College. So good luck, go forth, challenge, inspire, reflect. Yeah, take care.